The vastness of space was a silent, endless expanse, a place where time stretched into infinity, and nothing moved except the distant stars. For centuries, the Galactic Union, a coalition of species from across the universe, had maintained peace and order within the cosmos. Technology had advanced, and the galaxy had become a well-connected network of civilizations. But one day, something shattered this calm. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible signal, a distress call floating in the void from a far-flung sector of the galaxy. It was brief, distorted, and full of static, but there was one part of the message that stuck out. "We are being consumed. Help us before we are no more." The voice, though garbled and unclear, sounded desperate at first. The Union dismissed it as a malfunction. They had grown accustomed to picking up random bursts of cosmic radiation or broken transmissions from long-forgotten civilizations. But then the signal repeated, louder, clearer, and with a deeper sense of urgency. It was not random, it was deliberate. Something was trying to get through. Something or someone was asking for help. The Galactic Union's council was quick to respond. Their first thought was that it could be a neighboring star system that had fallen victim to a natural disaster, maybe a catastrophic event or a rogue black hole. However, when they analyzed the frequency of the signal, it was unlike anything they had encountered. It was almost alive. Captain Evelyn Carter, who commanded the USS Vigilance, one of the most advanced human warships, was the first to recognize the weight of the signal. Carter was known for her strategic brilliance and sharp instincts, and when the signal came through her ship's communications, she immediately felt the gravity of the situation. Something was wrong, and this wasn't just any distress call, it was a warning. A warning that carried a sense of terror, one that hinted at a threat far greater than any military conflict or war they had ever known. This isn't a request for help. It's a cry from the very edge of survival, Carter thought, her mind racing. The captain quickly ordered the crew to triangulate the source of the signal, and within moments, they pinpointed its origin, a distant, uncharted region of space that was far outside the normal travel lanes of the Union. It was a sector so remote, so isolated, that very few ships ever ventured near it. The area was known for being hazardous, with swirling cosmic anomalies, unstable star systems, and scattered debris from past catastrophes. It was a place forgotten by time, where civilizations had risen and fallen without ever being remembered. Now, it seemed that something new was emerging from that forgotten corner, a threat that had the potential to tear through the fabric of the galaxy itself. Captain Carter immediately informed the Galactic Union. She was convinced that whatever had sent the distress signal was no ordinary enemy. It wasn't just some hostile species looking for conquest, it was something much more dangerous. The message hinted at a force, an unknown predator that consumed entire civilizations, perhaps even entire star systems, without leaving a trace. Carter's instincts told her that if the Union didn't act quickly, they might find themselves at the mercy of a threat so powerful, so alien, that no one could hope to survive. The Union's response was swift but cautious. They couldn't afford to take any chances, so they called for an emergency coalition. The galaxy's mightiest fleets, including those of the Andorians, the Exariths, and, of course, the humans, were summoned to assemble in the heart of the galaxy. The Union was a mix of different species, each bringing their own technology and expertise, and together they had been able to keep peace for generations. But now they were facing an unknown enemy, and for the first time in centuries, there was doubt. No one knew what lay ahead, but there was a shared sense of dread that this would be different. This was no ordinary mission. This was a fight for survival. ASC, the fleets gathered. Captain Carter's crew aboard the Vigilance prepared for the unknown. The ship was one of the finest in the human fleet, equipped with advanced weaponry, shields, and communication technology. Yet, despite its impressive capabilities, Carter knew that the ship and its crew might be no match for whatever was out there. The unknown enemy was stirring in the darkness, and the fleet had no idea what kind of danger awaited them. The only thing they knew for sure was that the fate of entire worlds was at stake. The more Carter thought about the message, the more she felt the weight of its implications. What kind of creature or force could reduce a thriving civilization to nothing more than ashes, leaving only the echo of a warning behind? The emergency coalition fleet set off into the unknown, traveling through star systems that had once been rich with life, but were now silent and empty. As they approached the source of the signal, the tension among the fleet's commanders was palpable. They had faced alien threats before, species that sought to conquer, conquerors who wanted to claim resources or enslave populations. But this was something new. This was a predator, something that didn't just conquer, it devoured. The fleet was led by humans, and their reputation for bravery and innovation had made them a respected force in the galaxy. But even the might of the combined fleets could not erase the doubt that lingered in the hearts of those who joined the mission. There was no way to prepare for something so foreign, so terrifying. What if this was humanity's final battle? What if the distress signal was a trap? What if there was nothing to save? With each passing moment, the Vigilance and its fleet drew closer to the source, and the eerie silence of space pressed in on them, amplifying the fear that lurked beneath the surface. They were about to enter the void, a place where danger and death waited, and no one knew if they would ever return. The signal that had once seemed so distant and insignificant now felt like a countdown to something unimaginable. The galaxy's mightiest fleet was moving toward a war that could decide the fate of all life in the universe, and they had no idea what they were walking into. The unknown enemy had already begun to stir, and soon they would face it head-on. The fleet was ready for battle, but the question remained, could they win? Or would they, like those before them, be consumed by the darkness? The Vigilance and its coalition fleet sailed through the vast expanse toward the coordinates of the distress signal, their engines humming steadily as they ventured deeper into the forgotten sector. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence seemed to grow around them. The stars themselves appeared dimmer, as though shying away from whatever dark force lingered in the shadows ahead. Finally, as they crossed the edge of a shattered star system, they saw it. What had once been a thriving human colony, filled with vibrant life and bustling cities, was now an eerie, hollow graveyard. The wreckage was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Massive buildings that once housed thousands lay in heaps of twisted metal, their structures buckled and cracked, as if they had been torn apart by an invisible force. The surface of the planet was marred with deep scars, where huge sections of the land had been ripped away, leaving gaping wounds in the planet's surface. The fleet's scanners could detect no signs of life, no warmth, no movement. It was as though the colony had never existed, the life force of an entire civilization erased in an instant. The atmosphere, once rich with human energy, now felt cold and devoid of hope. There was no sign of battle, no signs of ships engaged in a violent conflict, only silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of the ship's engines and the occasional creak of the Vigilance as it slowly descended into the atmosphere. Carter's heart pounded in her chest as she gazed at the devastation below. It wasn't just the physical destruction that unnerved her, it was the absence of life, the strange emptiness that gripped her as she looked out over the ruined colony. Where were the survivors? If they had managed to escape, why hadn't they left any trace? If something had attacked them, there should have been evidence: scorched earth, bloodied corpses, signs of desperate resistance, but there was nothing. Captain Carter quickly ordered the fleet to prepare for landing. She knew that she could not afford to sit idly by while the mystery of the colony's disappearance hung in the air. There had to be some explanation, some clue that would reveal what had happened here. She gathered a small away team, including Lieutenant Michael Owens, her most trusted security officer, and Dr. Selena Morrow, the fleet's chief scientist. They were ready to explore the devastation and gather whatever information they could. As the team prepared to leave the ship, Carter's mind raced. What kind of force could wipe out an entire colony without leaving a trace? What could have been powerful enough to cause this level of destruction and yet remain so elusive? The away team's shuttle touched down gently on the barren ground, its landing gear kicking up small clouds of dust as they stepped out onto the planet's surface. The atmosphere was thick and oppressive, the air heavy with the weight of something unseen. There was no life here, no birds or insects, no sign of any plant life. It was as if the planet had been sterilized, scrubbed clean of everything that once lived. The ruins of the colony stretched out in all directions, the skeletal remains of buildings looming like ghostly reminders of what had once been. The team moved carefully through the wreckage, their boots crunching on the charred earth as they examined the fallen structures. The buildings that had once been homes, stores, and schools were now little more than twisted heaps of metal and concrete. Everything appeared to have been torn apart violently. Yet there were no burn marks, no obvious signs of bombardment, just an overwhelming sense of devastation, as if something had swept through, erasing it all without effort. As they moved through the ruins, Dr. Morrow knelt down by a patch of dirt near a collapsed building. "Captain, you need to see this," she called out, her voice sharp with a mix of curiosity and concern. Carter and Owens quickly made their way over to where Morrow was crouched, examining strange markings in the dirt. At first glance, it looked like the ground had been disturbed, as if something massive had passed through, leaving deep impressions in the soil. Upon closer inspection, Carter noticed the strange pattern. It wasn't random, these imprints were almost systematic, as if something had been moving through the land, deliberately carving a path of destruction. The markings were uneven and jagged, as though the force responsible for them hadn't cared about leaving any kind of order in its wake. It was as if the very earth had been gouged out, torn apart by something too powerful and too immense for the eye to comprehend. "This isn't just destruction," Carter said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "This is consumption. Whatever did this didn't just destroy the colony, it devoured it." Owens, who had been scanning the area for any signs of life, gave a grim nod. "There's no trace of human presence, Captain. It's like they vanished into thin air. We found no bodies, no shelters, no emergency signals, nothing." Dr. Morrow stood up, looking troubled. "We should get back to the ship. Whatever did this, it's not finished. We need to gather more data." The team moved back toward the shuttle, their minds heavy with the strange discovery. The silence that surrounded them seemed to close in, as if the planet itself was hiding something that it didn't want them to find. Once aboard the Vigilance, the crew worked furiously to analyze the data they had collected. The sensors didn't detect anything unusual. There were no signs of advanced technology, no alien ships or weaponry that might explain the destruction. But there was something else, something far more unnerving. The debris patterns were too clean, too precise. The very layout of the colony had been dismantled with a chilling sense of purpose. The fleet's engineers and scientists worked late into the night, scanning every piece of data they could extract, trying to find a pattern, a clue that might explain what had happened here. But as hours passed, a terrible realization began to settle in. This wasn't just an attack, it was something far older, something that had come from the very depths of the unknown. Something had hunted the colony, and it had left no survivors. The enemy they faced had already proven its power, and it wasn't done. As Carter stared out at the empty horizon, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true nature of this threat was far more terrifying than anything they could imagine. The vanished colony was just the beginning, and something darker was coming. And so, with the cold weight of uncertainty pressing down on her, Captain Carter ordered the fleet to move forward. But deep in her heart, she feared they were walking into the jaws of a force that even the mightiest of fleets might not survive. The Vigilance and its fleet continued their journey into the heart of the galaxy's darkest, most forgotten regions. They had already seen the ruin of the human colony, a silent testament to something beyond their understanding. The strange imprints in the soil, the unnatural silence, it all pointed to a force unlike any other. But as they pressed deeper into enemy territory, something new emerged, something that could shed light on the horrifying mystery that had already begun to unfold. A distress signal, a new transmission came through, but this time it wasn't from the enemy. It was from someone who had survived. The voice crackled through the fleet's comms, distorted, garbled by static and broken fragments of fear. Captain Carter immediately gave orders for the team to enhance the signal, hoping to catch any meaningful words. The voice sounded strained, barely hanging on, but through the distortion, they caught something chilling. They, the devourers, they consume worlds. Help. Too late. The transmission was a jumble of desperate sentences, but there was a singular truth that rang through the static. The colony hadn't been destroyed by a conventional enemy. It hadn't fallen to a war, nor had it been a natural disaster. It had been consumed. A terrifying alien species, known only as the Devourers, had wiped out the colony, and now it seemed they were on their way to consume even more. The name, the Devourers, sent a shiver down Carter's spine. The voice on the other end spoke of them like they were something ancient, something far older than any recorded civilization. They weren't just conquerors. The survivors said they were predators. In the most primal sense of the word, they hunted entire civilizations, not for resources, but to feed off them, to absorb their technology, culture, and very essence until nothing was left but a hollow shell. These beings didn't just conquer, they consumed. The survivor's voice grew weaker as the transmission continued, a haunting realization settling in. The colony was lost, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. The Vigilance's crew listened in horror as the survivor described the Devourer's methods in more detail. The destruction wasn't swift, no explosions or grand battles. It was a slow, agonizing process of dismantling an entire world, erasing all evidence of life, culture, and history, one city at a time, until the planet was nothing more than a lifeless husk. They came from the void, and they don't stop, the survivor whispered, his voice trembling. No one escapes. No one survives. Captain Carter immediately ordered the fleet to track the source of the transmission. They had to find out where the survivor was, to get answers, and hopefully, to find any remaining survivors. But as they closed in on the coordinates, the reality of their situation hit them harder than ever before. They were up against something far older, far more powerful than they could have ever prepared for. The Devourers weren't just an enemy, they were a force of nature, a plague that swept across the galaxy, consuming everything in its path. They were the very thing that could destroy the Galactic Union itself, the thing that had haunted the darkest corners of every species' worst nightmares. It seemed impossible, but the more Carter thought about the survivor's words, the more she realized the truth. The Devourers were not a myth. They were real, and they were coming. The fleet began to move toward the survivor's location, every ship on high alert. The air was thick with tension. They could feel the looming presence of the enemy, even if it wasn't yet visible. It was a cold, crawling fear that swept through the ranks of the fleet. As they approached, they found the source of the transmission another planet, one that had once been a flourishing hub of human activity. But now, it was a dead world, its atmosphere barren and stripped of any trace of life. The Vigilance lowered its shields and descended cautiously toward the planet's surface, hoping to find anything that could give them an advantage. The away team, once again led by Captain Carter, disembarked to investigate. The planet's surface was as quiet and desolate as the last. The buildings were ruins, the landscape devoid of life. Yet, there was something different here, something that made the air feel thick, as though it were saturated with the remnants of something dark. As they moved forward, the team discovered what remained of the human colony, a series of structures, their exteriors damaged, yet eerily intact. The survivors had left hurried notes, written in haste, telling of their escape, of their last desperate attempts to flee the inevitable. But the further they went into the colony, the clearer it became that there were no survivors left. The darkness of the Devourers had claimed this place too. One of the survivors' personal logs, found in the wreckage of a collapsed building, confirmed the nightmare that had been unfolding across the galaxy. The Devourers, it seemed, were an ancient species who had wandered the stars for millennia, feeding on entire civilizations. These creatures didn't conquer worlds, they didn't need to. They simply came, devoured everything, and moved on to the next. Entire star systems had already fallen to their insatiable hunger, leaving nothing behind but ruin. And now, the fleet was standing on the precipice of the same fate. It was clear now, they were outmatched. The weapons of the fleet, though advanced, seemed like toys compared to the primal force of the Devourers. Their technology, their speed, their ability to consume entire worlds, they were not an enemy the Galactic Union could fight with conventional means. Captain Carter stood in the center of the ruined colony, her gaze sweeping over the devastation. The survivor's warning echoed in her mind. No one survives. No one escapes. The fleet was facing a force unlike any they had ever encountered, and the fate of the galaxy seemed uncertain. Desperation began to set in as they realized the truth. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting an extinction event, a predator that left nothing but emptiness in its wake. The more they learned, the less they understood. The Devourers were ancient, relentless, and beyond comprehension. And if they couldn't find a way to stop them, the galaxy might soon be nothing more than a graveyard of lost civilizations. As the fleet retreated, Carter's mind raced. The survivor's words played on a loop in her mind. She had known war, had fought battles against all manner of alien races. But this was something else entirely. It was not just a fight for survival, it was a race against time. A race to find some hope, some way to stop the Devourers before they reached the heart of the galaxy. The clock was ticking, and the fear of what they would find next gripped her with unrelenting force. The only question now was whether they would be able to stop them, or if they would become just another hollowed-out husk in the wake of the Devourer's hunger. As the fleet moved closer to the planet, the full scale of the devastation became undeniable. What had once been a flourishing human settlement, brimming with life and activity, was now nothing more than a haunting landscape of death and ruin. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, heavy with ash that swirled in the toxic air, choking any hope of survival. Towering above the wreckage stood a massive fortress, unlike anything humanity had ever built. It was dark, jagged, and foreboding, its sharp spires piercing the ashen sky. This was no ordinary structure. It was a creation of the Devourers, an alien species capable of consuming entire worlds. It was their base of operations, their heart, and it stood as a grim reminder of their unstoppable power. The ground around the fortress was littered with the remnants of human technology, broken ships, twisted metal, shattered communications arrays, proof that the settlement had once thrived before the Devourers had descended upon it. Captain Carter stood at the bridge of the Vigilance, her gaze fixed on the fortress below. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. This was humanity's last stand. If they failed here, it would be the end of everything. The Devourers had already swept through countless worlds, leaving nothing but silence and ruin in their wake. If they allowed them to consume another colony, it would mean the extinction of all that they had built, all that they had fought for. There was no time left for diplomacy, no room for retreat. They had to strike now. "Captain, we're in range," Lieutenant Owens reported, his voice tense as the battle fleet formed up around the Vigilance. "The fortress is heavily fortified. Our conventional weapons won't be enough to penetrate its defenses." Carter's mind raced. She had known this would be their final confrontation, but she hadn't anticipated the Devourer's fortress being so imposing, so impenetrable. Every option seemed to lead to the same grim conclusion. Humanity was facing a force that was simply too powerful to defeat with traditional methods. But Carter wasn't one to surrender in the face of impossible odds. "Not now. Not ever. We need to use everything we've got," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "Prepare the fleet for a coordinated assault. We'll hit them with everything we have, shields up, weapons primed. We're not leaving without a fight." The fleet immediately began to mobilize, launching waves of fighters and bombers, each squadron diving toward the fortress with relentless precision. The space above the planet turned into a chaotic battleground, flashes of light and energy filling the void as the human ships engaged the Devourer's defenses. The fortress seemed to come alive, its weapons retaliating with unyielding force. Laser beams tore through the blackened sky, cutting down human ships one by one. The sounds of explosions and cries for help echoed through the comms, but the fleet pressed on, undeterred by the mounting losses. Carter's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the battle unfold on the screens in front of her. The Devourers fought like a singular entity, their movements sharp and calculated, as though they had been preparing for this moment for eons. They didn't fight to win, they fought to consume, to destroy, to erase. And every human life they took brought them closer to that ultimate goal. Yet the humans didn't falter. The courage of the fleet was unmatched, each pilot and soldier pushing themselves to the limits of endurance, their hearts fueled by the knowledge that the fate of all humanity hung in the balance. The battle stretched on, with no end in sight. Carter watched as more ships fell, as brave pilots disappeared into the vastness of space, but still, humanity held its ground. They fought with everything they had, determined not to let the Devourers wipe them from existence. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a message came through, cutting through the noise of the battle like a lifeline. It was from Dr. Morrow, the fleet's chief scientist. "Captain, we have a prototype weapon," she said, urgency evident in her voice. "It's a long shot, but it might be our only chance. It's a powerful energy cannon capable of breaching the fortress' outer defenses. But there's a catch: the weapon requires a massive power drain. We'll need to sacrifice a part of the fleet's energy to fire it." Carter didn't hesitate. "Do it. Whatever it takes, Dr. Morrow. Prepare the cannon." The crew worked quickly, rerouting all available power to the cannon, knowing that the price of failure would be too high to bear. The Vigilance shook as the power reserves began to deplete. The massive energy cannon, located on the underside of the ship, charged up with a deep, resonant hum, a glow building around the barrel. Carter's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. This was their final opportunity. If this didn't work, there would be nothing left to do but fight until the end. Firing in 3, 2, 1, Morrow's voice came through. The Vigilance's hull shuddered as the cannon unleashed its devastating blast. A massive beam of energy shot forth from the ship, streaking through the blackness of space with a blinding intensity. It struck the Devourer's fortress with a thunderous explosion, sending shockwaves across the planet's surface. The fortress, once thought impervious, began to tremble, its outer defenses cracking under the sheer power of the blast. But it wasn't enough. The fortress withstood the assault, its shields flaring, but they held. Carter's heart sank. They had come so close, yet the fortress was still standing. "Captain," Owen shouted from his station, "the energy reserves are almost depleted. We can't sustain another blast like that." Carter's mind raced, her eyes scanning the battlefield, searching for a solution. She knew they couldn't afford to let the Devourers win, but time was running out. A thought flashed through her mind: if they couldn't break through the outer defenses, maybe they could target the fortress's core. A direct hit would cause a chain reaction, destroying it from the inside out. But it would require precision. It would require someone to get up close, to risk everything. Her gaze locked with Owen's, and he knew what she was about to say. "I'll take it," he said before she could speak. "Captain, I can make the run. Just give me the order." Carter hesitated, a heavy weight settling in her chest. She couldn't ask him to make that sacrifice, not willingly, but she knew there was no other choice. "Do it, Lieutenant. You'll have your chance. Make it count." The seconds seemed to stretch as Owens piloted his fighter toward the fortress, weaving through the devastating firestorm as explosions erupted around him. Every nerve in his body screamed in protest, but he pushed forward. He had no choice. The fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders. With one final burst of speed, he locked onto the fortress's core, his target clear. "This is it," he whispered to himself. And then, as the countdown ticked down to 0, he launched the final, desperate strike, the fate of humanity, riding on that one shot. The impact was immediate, and the fortress trembled violently as a chain reaction of energy blasts cascaded through the structure. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, humanity had a chance. The battle had raged for what seemed like an eternity. The void of space filled with the screams of ships in flames and the relentless thrum of energy blasts. The Vigilance, its once pristine hull now scarred and battered from the relentless assault, had become a symbol of humanity's determination. Captain Carter stood firm at the bridge, her hands clenched into fists, as the final offensive loomed on the horizon. The fleet was running on fumes, its resources stretched thin, and the enemy, relentless, unforgiving, and far superior in strength, had shown no signs of slowing. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had something the Devourers didn't: an unyielding will to survive. Carter had made the decision. There was no turning back now. With the fate of the galaxy hanging by a thread, she gave the order. "Prepare the energy cannon." Her voice was steady, yet sharp with a hint of finality. "This is it." The command was transmitted across the fleet, and in response, the remaining human ships rallied around the Vigilance. Every crew member, every soldier, and every pilot knew what had to be done. This was their last chance, the final strike against the fortress, the heart of the Devourer's might. The experimental weapon, a last-ditch effort of human innovation, was the galaxy's only hope. The cannon hummed to life, its systems drawing power from every available reserve, every scrap of energy the Vigilance could muster. As the final charge built up, Carter's mind raced. They had come so far, endured so much, and yet the outcome was still uncertain. The weapon they were about to fire was humanity's greatest invention, its last shot at survival. But at what cost? A brilliant flash of light erupted from the Vigilance as the energy cannon unleashed its full force. The beam, a pure, searing streak of power, sliced through the blackness of space toward the Devourer fortress. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire galaxy paused to witness the outcome. The light from the cannon was blinding, and the sound that followed was deafening, a massive shockwave that reverberated across the battlefield. The beam struck the fortress directly at its core, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The colossal structure trembled violently, its defenses unable to withstand the sheer force of the weapon. Then, with a sound that seemed to shake the very stars, the fortress exploded. The explosion was immense, a blinding burst of fiery light that consumed everything in its wake. The fortress, once thought to be indestructible, collapsed into a fiery cloud of debris, sending shockwaves rippling through space. For a brief moment, the battlefield was silent. The Devourers, caught off guard by the unexpected human innovation and sheer resolve, faltered. Their forces, thrown into disarray, began to retreat, their once unshakable confidence shattered. The tides of war had shifted, but victory came at a terrible price. The cannon had drained every last drop of energy from the Vigilance, and the ship now stood vulnerable, its systems flickering weakly. There would be no more shots, no more defenses. The Vigilance was a sitting target. Carter knew that the fleet's victory wasn't assured yet. The battle raged on, and the Devourers, though shaken, were not yet defeated. Their forces still outnumbered the human fleet, and the odds were still heavily stacked against them. As the Vigilance drifted in space, its systems on the brink of collapse, Carter knew that this could be their final moment. The crew had given everything they had, fought with every ounce of strength, but the question remained, would it be enough? The Devourers were still out there, and they wouldn't stop. Not until they had consumed every last world in their path. The fleet's remaining ships, battered and exhausted, moved into position, prepared to fight until the end. Every human aboard those ships understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a single battle. It was about the survival of everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for. It was about the future of the galaxy itself. As Carter watched the battlefield unfold before her, she knew that whatever happened next, humanity had proven its worth. They had shown the galaxy that they could stand against the impossible, that they would not go quietly into the night. "All ships, hold formation," Carter commanded, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "We're not done yet." The fleet, though battered, held fast. The human resolve was unshakable, and the Devourers now faced an unexpected foe. Carter's heart pounded as she watched the last remnants of their forces engage, every human ship pushing forward, every soldier fighting for their survival. In that moment, the galaxy saw something it had never witnessed before. Humanity, once seen as weak and fragile, had revealed its true strength. It was not in its numbers, not in its weapons, but in its spirit, its refusal to give up, even in the face of annihilation. The Vigilance and the humans aboard it had become a symbol of that spirit. As the battle raged on, a new hope began to take root. The Devourers, though powerful, were not invincible. And as the human fleet pressed forward, with their backs against the wall and the very survival of the galaxy on the line, something shifted. The Devourers had underestimated humanity. They had thought them weak, fragile, easily broken, but they were wrong. Humanity had fought back with everything they had, and they weren't done yet. The galaxy watched, transfixed, as the Vigilance and its fleet stood resolute, determined to protect the future of all life. And though the war was far from over, one thing was certain: humanity was no longer just a small, insignificant player in the grand scheme of the galaxy. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the Devourers would soon learn that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The war was just beginning. But for the first time, humanity had a glimmer of hope. The galaxy would never be the same again.